Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
Paso pitches, Williams swings, there's a high drive, going deep, it is a home run!
My guest today is Ann R. Keene. Ann Keene is an Austin, Texas-based author of a truly unique book with a Field of Dreams flair about World War II and baseball. As you watch the World Series this year, you will enjoy hearing today's backstory on Ann's book, The Cloudbuster Nine, the untold story of Ted Williams and the baseball team that helped win World War II. Today, she'll tell you how she came across scrapbooks and pictures to write this account of some of the greatest baseball stars to ever play the game, Ted Williams and Johnny Sain, when they trained to become fighter pilots during World War II. As a child, Ann's father was a batboy and mascot for a Navy baseball team called the Cloudbusters. The team was manned by coaches and cadets who trained at the Special Ground Training Base in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, amongst 24 major league players from every big league team of the era, including the St. Louis Cardinals, the New York Yankees, Cleveland Indians, the Cincinnati Reds, you name it. Military baseball was popular during World War II, but in 1943, the Cloudbuster pilots were even better than the New York Yankees, who had won the World Series in 1943 against the Cardinals. For training and morale, the Cloudbusters played against Marine and Navy teams, factory squads manned by textile workers and men building airplanes in the Carolinas, and a host of nearby colleges such as Duke, North Carolina State, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is Ann's alma mater. They also played in a special war bond game at Yankee Stadium against a team managed by Babe Ruth. This story is about a lot more than baseball. It's about presidents, astronauts, famous sports coaches and Olympians, outdoor survival experts, and college presidents from the greatest generation who all came together at 5 small, ultra-elite schools to train pilots bound for the Pacific. Ann's work has appeared in publications ranging from the New York Times to the Austin American-Statesman. The Cloudbuster Nine was recently mentioned by Chicago Sun-Times entertainment reviewer Richard Roper, former co-host of Ebert and Roper and the Movies, as a top read during the pandemic, with familiar themes such as wartime baseball and rationing. Ann has talked about the Cloudbuster Nine at the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, the National World War II Museum, recently joining a talk with the Boston Red Sox historian and other leading baseball writers on the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. She is also featured with John Thorne, Major League Baseball historian, and Yankee historian Marty Appel on a Fox Nation documentary that is now streaming about Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio when they visited the White House in 1991, receiving an award from their good friend, President George H.W. Bush, 50 years after their record-breaking season in 1941. Today, Ann will mention names we all know: astronaut John Glenn and Scott Carpenter, Bear Bryant, Notre Dame's Jim Crowley, boxer Jack Dempsey, Johnny Carson and entertainer Ed McMahon, Jesse Owens' track coach Larry Snyder, and basketball's John Wooden, who are all part of this story. Ann is a Southerner and a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill School of Journalism, who began her professional career as a press secretary on Capitol Hill for the late Ike Skelton from Lexington, Missouri, who chaired the House Armed Services Committee. You can read about Ann and her work on her website, annrkeene.com. That's www.annrkeene.com. ANNERKEENE.com, and follow her on Facebook and on her page about the Cloudbuster Nine. And we are delighted that she's here with us today. Welcome, Ann Keene.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be on your show.
I really appreciate it. I enjoyed your book. It's really interesting, and it's amazing to me that story is basically untold for such a long time.
Well, I can tell you a little more about that one, but no, wonderful, great.
And it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today we have Tank 7 American Saison Ale from the Boulevard Brewing Company of Kansas City, Missouri. This Belgian-style farmhouse ale came together in fermenter number 7 there at the brewery, so it got its famous name, Tank 7. Tank 7 Ale begins with distinct grapefruit hoppy notes and complex flavors, so this straw-colored beer then tapers off to a peppery and dry finish. It is widely considered, as one of the ultimate food pairing beers in existence today. Remember, the best way to enjoy the podcast is while sipping one of the featured brews for yourself. And if you want to get new episodes immediately after they're released, just subscribe to the podcast on one of the many podcast directories, and we're on them all. If you want additional information, you can like our Facebook page as well. And thank you to all of the listeners. If you enjoy an episode, please share it with a friend. And with my Tank 7, I say cheers. So admittedly, in your past, you weren't really an avid baseball fan. Your book details how you get interested, and of course, there's the baseball connection with your father, which you can speak to. Could you talk about how you got interested in the story, and then maybe answer that question, why it took 75 years to really bring it to light?
Well, my father's name was Jim Rao, James Plummer Rao, Jr., and he was obsessed with baseball. And he had 2 daughters. Of course, I'm the oldest daughter. I have a younger sister, Carson. Never got that son to play baseball. We actually were swimmers. We found other sports. But my father, every way throughout the year, watched baseball, listened to baseball, followed baseball, talked about it. You know, I knew he had gotten hurt. I knew he had a brush with the major leagues, and knew he was an All-American pitcher at Carolina, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where the book is set. But again, with the daughter, and he saw her father talk to everyone, stranger, a good friend, a neighbor. Every day he went to lunch with a group of friends, and they talked about baseball. And, you know, again, it was a bittersweet story, though, because the family, it was just all over our house. You know, everywhere we were listening to it or hearing the box scores literally getting torn out of the newspaper. Stacks of, you know, ESPN, Sports Illustrated Baseball Magazine. So again, it was really, he was in his own private world, but it was a little much, you know, because it was, being the daughter, maybe I wanted to talk about other things, but he also mentored young players. And he never really told us when they would come into the house, but every now and then I'd see a young kid on the couch, and my dad, you know, this was in the 70s and the 80s when I was growing up in high school. He was trying to give these young boys just tips. You know, some of them, you know, did make it into the minor leagues, but of course they wanted to become major league players. But again, he was always out there talking about baseball, or, you know, had an ear to listen to someone else about the game. So again, I guess your question is, how did I get interested? I learned about it from my father, but again, I never really knew why he left the game that he loved so dearly. And the book is actually personal. It's about really what happens to a man too when they get hurt, when they lose that dream, and when they come so very close. And so therefore, it's a really personal story. Very difficult to write from a daughter's perspective. I had great compassion for my father. Again, that was his dream, never quite achieved. But I guess, again, to answer the question, it's a bittersweet story. That was really the basis of the book.
Well, that comes through, actually, when you're reading it. There's no question about that. And that's for me, one of the enjoyable parts of reading the book. I did like the history of it, right? I like the history of that program that you detail. I like the fact that Ted Williams is involved, of course, iconic baseball hero. And then that connection with your father, it all comes through. I really enjoyed it. position that baseball found itself in at the beginning of the war.
Right.
It came under fire because people said, well, why are you even playing baseball at this time? There's too many other, there's rationing going on. There's too many other problems the country has to deal with. And these players are just playing a game when there's stakes riding on what's going on in the war that are much larger than a game. And Franklin Roosevelt kind of writes a letter, the green light letter, saying that America needs baseball. And then you see this influx of baseball players who actually enlist in the military.
With the green light letter, it was a debate. I mean, it's kind of like today dealing with COVID. What's better for the American public? The president, FDR, was a huge baseball fan. Grew up playing baseball in high school, and he and Eleanor, his wife, loved going to games. But in his heart, he knew that they had to keep the game going during the war, mainly to boost morale. And then, yeah, you're absolutely right. There were more than 5,000 minor league players who enlisted in the service and more than 500 major league players during the course of the war. I've interviewed some of the oldest surviving players today. We're down to about 24 major league players who served in World War II. But guys like Ted Williams, he wouldn't have had it any other way. And I'd like to get into that. But, of course, here they are in the prime of their careers. Who wants to do that, to pause their career and join the service? But pretty much every one of them did it, and they did it because they wanted to do it. Dr. Bobby Brown, he's, I believe, one of the oldest living Yankees. He will be 96 next week. He lives in Fort Worth, and I sat down with him a couple years ago to write the Cloudbuster Nine, and I asked him, I said, so what was that like? Here you are. I believe he won the 1947 World Series with the Yankees. But again, here you are at the prime of your career. How did that feel to hang up your cleats, per se, and join the service? And he said, Ann, we wouldn't have had it any other way. You just did it. Again, you just did it. A very duty-oriented generation. And he said all of my friends felt that way.
Well, let's go to the story of Ted Williams specifically. How does he initially enlist? Your book details it, but could you describe how he enlists in the Navy? I know the Army was after him too, but he ends up joining the Navy.
Of all things, I have a little story about Quincy. Obviously, John Henry is the owner of the Red Sox, who is from Quincy. But Ted Williams, he was very ambivalent about it. Did he want to join the service? No, not really. I mean, his mother was dependent on him, so it was like a ping pong ball back and forth. And what my understanding is, he did kind of a little under the radar visit down to Quincy Air Base near Boston. And, again, the Army was after him, but this was a naval station, and he took a tour with a guy named Whitey Fuller, who was a Navy recruiter. I believe he had played football for Dartmouth. And so they were athletes. They spoke the same language, tough guys. And he takes Ted down to Quincy, and they look around, and then all of a sudden he goes in and he sits in one of his first airplanes. I believe it was a yellow Hornet trainer, but he sat in it. He felt the interior. He looked at the instruments. He sat there in the cockpit for the very first time. And I think he was like, okay, this is what I want to do. And I want to become a Navy pilot. And again, being a Navy pilot in the Pacific, in the vast unknowns of the Pacific, where really the war began, where we got attacked at Pearl Harbor. I mean, that was one of the most dangerous, ambitious training paths in the service. But like Williams, who became a Marine combat pilot, again, with Jerry Coleman, another major leaguer, that was the path. And I believe, that decision was really made at that air station that day.
And I like that part of the story, too. It's so interesting. The other thing that comes through is Ted Williams isn't known as an academic type person. You talk about the most common grade he received, I think, in high school was a D.
Right.
He didn't have a college degree. Most pilots did, but of course there's a demand. Explain how that poor academic record almost propels him to succeed in that really demanding program.
Ted Williams, and I had the pleasure to get to know his daughter, Claudia. As she said she wrote a foreword in the book, she said he did nothing half-assed. And I would absolutely agree with that. In the service, he came in, he wasn't a great student. In fact, I got his grades and his report cards, and sure enough, he was a C&D student, but he was a brilliant man. And whatever he pursued it with his utmost passion. He put everything into it. And when he entered the service, especially during those early training courses, like at Amherst training station, he was curious and he did his best. And then suddenly he's one of the top students in the class. And so I think that's really important. He's a young guy. I believe he was 23 years old, not a college graduate, but he just wanted to prove that he was just as good, if not better, than anyone else, not only on the baseball field, but in the classroom. And sure enough, he began to excel in courses like physics. And again, that comes into play later with baseball. So by the time he ships into Chapel Hill in May of 1943, he feels pretty confident about his skills in the classroom. And again, he's going to be tested again with even more difficult courses just to prepare for the next level of flight training. But yeah, I think he did. He hit the books really hard. He studied late into the night. And again, he proved himself in the classroom there in Chapel Hill in that early naval training.
And you can see that determination in him. There's no question about that. Could you explain the program that he gets involved in, the V5 program?
That's really the basis of my book. When my father passed away, I started digging around a trunk, and I found a scrapbook from the World War II V5 Naval Aviation School. There were 5 of these V5 training campuses, and basically what they were was sports for war training. They were the 90-day physical conditioning course for pilots to get these guys in shape, especially, for fighting in the Pacific. So my grandfather had gone to Annapolis. And again, this is really the core of the book. When I get into the trunk and I start looking at these pictures, I find pictures of my grandfather, who served as the commander of one of the V5 bases. And again, he had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1926. And during peacetime, we get bombed with Pearl Harbor. He's older. He was in his late 30s. But some of his classmates from the academy came to him. He was working in the steel industry around Philadelphia. And they brought him back into the service to become an administrator of one of these V5 schools, basically to run the operations of the school. And again, they're based on sports, 10 different physical sports with outdoor survival training, some fairly substantial academics. But again, it's that 90-day course, and these were housed at the V5 Navy training school. And you asked about the education. What's really important is before the war broke out, before World War II, a lot of these V5 schools, they trained guys, were aiming to become officers in the service. They were college graduates, and if not that, they at least had some college under their belt. But we faced a severe pilot shortage going into World War II, an airplane shortage, a pilot shortage, training station shortage. And so what the Navy did was they dropped the education requirement down to high school. So therefore, major leaguers like Johnny Pesky, Ted Williams, who had no college education, they were able to enlist in this very important program.
And I did enjoy that because, as I mentioned to you before, I'd been in military training a number of years, and that resonates with me. And that training program specifically was incredibly tough, to the point where they compared it to modern SEAL training.
This was, of course, it was before the SEALs that we know today, but they used boxing, baseball, military track, wrestling, hand-to-hand combat. Spent several days out in the woods, gave them a map and said, you've got a day or two to get home. It's just that they competed against one another too. That's a really important part of the book. I found the last living baseball player from that squad and interviewed him before he passed away. He was 96 years old. And he really took me inside the V5 training program in Chapel Hill. His name was Ivan Flesser. He lived up in Marshall, Michigan, and we sat down for the day, and he said, Ann, we competed against one another. You were put in the boxing ring with your buddy, and you hated to hurt him, but you did it because your life depended on it. So they used sports like football, for example, to really enforce teamwork, if you will, hand-eye coordination, speed, dexterity. And again, baseball came into play because they not only trained with baseball, they sent the players out on the road. They formed their own teams. And the Cloudbusters, obviously, is the name of the team in Chapel Hill. But that year, in 1943, they went from having a decent squad to a team virtually wholly manned by major leaguers, because timing was such that players like Johnny Pesky, Joe Coleman, Buddy Gremp, Ted Williams shipped into base around that time. So again, it was, they hit the road on these old Navy buses on Wednesday evening. They went to Greensboro to play factory teams. They played college squads like NC State and Duke. They went up to Norfolk Naval Station, where they played some of the toughest Navy teams. And then again, the grand finale of the book is when they take that same bus up to New York to play a team managed by Babe Ruth, a major league team of Yankees and Indians. But again, so you're training all day, and then you're jumping on the buses during the week and on the weekends. And again, Ted Williams, he played the majority of his military baseball in Chapel Hill with the Cloudbuster Nine.
We can get back to Ted Williams then, since you brought him back up again. I'm wondering, first of all, one of the things that I enjoyed, and I know this is part of military training because through the training that I've been a part of, that we've run, every once in a while you get a son or daughter of a relatively famous person or someone who has a claim, and they're treated just like everyone else.
Right.
That happens to Ted Williams. In fact,
right.
I think you say in the book, when Ted Williams shows up, they say, "Oh, so here's the great Ted Williams, huh?"
Right.
Could you explain that? And then how do you think that military experience formed a young Ted Williams?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that he was someone, he really didn't want special attention. And that's what I understand. I read it in his records. I have his grades, his course records from Chapel Hill and throughout his military training. He just gave his heart and soul into everything. But this is also really important. He respected his peers. And I want to say that again. He respected his peers. When he got to Chapel Hill as a newbie cadet, he came in and all these guys, they stuck their heads out the window and they started saying, "Oh, it's, the great Ted Williams, we're going to test you here." And they called him Boots. That's what they called the newbies. They would say, "Boots, Boots, Boots." They would chant that as they would go through campus. But again, he was just like everybody else. They teased him. They put him in a college dorm with two guys that he had never met before. They didn't put him in there with Johnny Pesky because they wanted him to train really hard. And in terms of Ted being treated like with just an average guy, the last surviving player, Ivan Flesser, said, he goes, "Man, he was a great guy. He ate that bologna sandwich just like us in the bus at night. He worked really hard." And from what my dad told me growing up, Ted and Johnny, he not only went out there and watched him at batting practice every day at the field because he was, the bat boy, but he was the officer's kid. And Ted and Johnny were his babysitters. So imagine that. His father, being the commander of the base, recruits these guys to come watch a 9-year-old kid. And my dad always told these stories about them going to the varsity theater and, riding bicycles and Ted and Johnny coming over to the house. So, again, they really didn't get so-called special treatment.
What you find is these individuals like Ted Williams or Stan Musial from our area, they become iconic baseball players, but they always, or even Elvis Presley, they hearken back to that time they spent in the military. It almost sends a message to the modern day, generations that maybe they could benefit from that as well.
Well, they could, and they bonded as friends. And one thing that amazed me about this book, when I finished it, I started meeting children of coaches and cadets, children of Don Kepler, who was the baseball coach at Carolina, but also the head of the survival school, who became very close to Ted, really took him under his wings and taught him a lot about fishing and hunting. But Bear Bryant, for example, was the football coach at Carolina, and I'd also like to rattle off some names of the famous people who were there.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I was going to ask you about that, too.
Well, the Kepler children, though, they shared letters from Gerald Ford, who was also there, from Bear Bryant. They were personal letters written to the family about and Ted Williams, how much they greatly admired their father when he passed away. So my point, and this is really important, like Don Kepler, he became a baseball coach up at Penn State in his later years, but he remained close friends with Bear Bryant, but it was always under the radar. And when they became young men or older men, in their 60s and their 70s, they would telephone each other, and Bear Bryant would say, "Hey, I'm coming up to Penn State. Let's go meet in the back of a cafe and just catch up." Or he might swing by the house. So again, this is what these kids need to know now. These were deep friendships. They were honorable. They trusted each other with their lives. And that was formed when they were young cadets and coaches during World War II.
So you mentioned some of those famous people. And of course, it wasn't just the training program there at Chapel Hill. They had one in Iowa and in other locations. Who were some of the other people associated with the program?
Well, okay. Yeah, you mentioned the 5 schools. There was one in Monterey at the Del Monte Hotel, one in Iowa, University of Iowa, University of Georgia, and then one at St. Mary's in California. Now, some of the people associated with these schools, obviously in Chapel Hill, Presidents Gerald Ford, George Bush, and Ronald Reagan, who actually came in as an entertainer. And they missed each other by 2 weeks. That's my understanding. Obviously, Eleanor Roosevelt, she was a very close friend of Frank Porter Graham, who's president of Carolina, and he was Moonlight Graham's little brother. Moonlight Graham played baseball at Carolina. They both loved the sport, obviously. As you know, Moonlight Graham was the character who inspired Doc Graham from Field of Dreams. Now, another figure, which I bet you don't know about, is Admiral John Sidney Mccain Sr., and he was nicknamed SLU, but he was head of the Bureau of Aeronautics during the war, which organized the military aspects of naval aviation, which oversaw the formation of these schools. And I believe Roberta McCain, she would have been his daughter-in-law. She just passed away last week at age 108. That was Senator John McCain's mother. But other figures at Chapel Hill, they trained French officers. So Charles de Gaulle's son, Felipe, was there. He sat in the dugout with my dad at baseball games. Some other figures associated with the Iowa base and the California base were John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, of course, Bear Bryant, Jim Crowley, Bernie Bierman, Don Farrow, Bud Wilkinson, Frank Kimbrough, Tex Oliver, Jules Sykes, Jim Tatum, Matty Bell, Harvey Harmon, the Heisman Trophy winner of Tom Holman, an All-American Cleveland Browns Otto Graham. He was actually in Chapel Hill. Let's see, Gene Tunney, boxer. He was actually critical of the boxing program, but he came around. Jack Dempsey came to Chapel Hill to boost morale for the cadets. And then some of the baseball players, obviously, Charlie Gehringer, Ted Williams. And then the Wizard of Westwood, John Wooden, famous basketball coach. The World Wrestling Champion, Don George. And then Larry Snyder, he was Jesse Owens' track coach at OSU. I believe he was stationed in Iowa. And then in Chapel Hill, there was Cornelius Warmerdam. They called him the Flying Dutchman, a world champion pole vaulter. And Willie Turnessa, the U.S. amateur golf champion, was in Chapel Hill. And then there's Newt Loken and Norm Holzenfeld. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but they were leaders in gymnastics. And Holzenfeld, I believe, pioneered the use of the trampoline. They also had circus performers to teach the cadets how to tumble out of airplanes. World War I ace Eddie Rickenbacker came to Chapel Hill to give a talk, and William Clay Ford of Ford Motor Company, I believe he was at the St. Mary's Station. And then some of the famous sports writers were Grantland Rice. They had National Geographic writers, and also 2 gentlemen who headed up the survival school, John and Frank Craighead. You know, those are big names in environmental conservation. And then some of the entertainers, Kate Smith, who obviously sang God Bless America, came to Chapel Hill. Bob Hope, I believe, was at the Georgia station. Another famous figure was Ed Mcmahon from The Tonight Show, and he trained at the Georgia station, and he became a decorated Marine combat pilot. And, of course, there was actor Dennis Weaver, who I believe trained at St. Mary's and was a track star. And then even the tobacco era, Doris Duke, she spent time in Chapel Hill working in a lab. She obviously traveled around the world, had properties in Hawaii, and she was an expert, or became one, on some tropical diseases. So she worked in a lab on the Chapel Hill campus during the war. So again, it was just incredible, some of the people who spent time on these campuses.
That's exactly what I was going to say. What an incredible list. It had to be a target to get all of those athletes and influential people. When the recruiters were going out, and I know you detail it in your book, is it do they target people like this? They want those types of individuals, Olympians and professional athletes and professional prize fighters, to be part of this program?
Well, that's a great question. Yes and no. I mean, during the war, it's kind of like what we're dealing with now with COVID. Things are paused. During World War II, they were looking to give back in any way possible. And so what they had was the availability of the best coaches and athletes in the world. And so, of course, they wanted the cream of the crop. In the book, I described it as a Camelot of professional athletes. I mean, you had professional football players, boxers, you name it, even Olympic swimming coaches. But at the same time, when you look for a cadet, of course, you wanted someone with this gravitas who everyone in the world admired. But you also wanted a guy who was not going to break from formation. And I found an article from Esquire magazine where the reporter trailed John Glenn. And, of course, The Right Stuff, you think of that. And John Glenn was a recruiter. And when these kids walked through the door, they didn't necessarily want that guy who came in and boasted and said, well, I'm the captain of the football team and I'm a straight A student and I can do this and I'm better than you and I can do that. In fact, that really turned them off. And what the Esquire reporter noted is they kind of turned to each other when one of those kids walked through bragging, and they said, oh, you just slay me, sir. And they scratched him off the list. So again, they wanted the humble guys. They didn't necessarily want those top students. Again, they were, mainly getting high school graduates. Even George Bush was a high school graduate. But I'll tell you something about him. He was extremely humble. And I think at the end of the day, they wanted that guy who, again, was not going to break formation and who was going to do anything to serve his country. So that, if you will, was the magic ingredient of being humble and generous and brave. That's really what they were looking for.
Could you describe who the fighting American Tom Hamilton was?
Yeah, Tom Hamilton had gone to the Naval Academy with my grandfather. I believe he was a class behind him, but he was just a legendary athlete. He grew up in Columbus, Ohio. I believe he had 4 brothers. But again, he was gifted not only as a football player, in many famous games, but he was gifted as a coach. And when he enlisted in the Navy, he became a carrier pilot. And so when World War II breaks out, he was truly handpicked from the higher-ups in the Navy to come up with a training program for the Navy pilots. So again, he's one of the best football players ever in college. He became a football coach at the Naval Academy, and he becomes a carrier pilot. So he's got these magic ingredients. And again, I've got to know his son and his niece. And he was just one of these great guys who had just gravitas, huge character. Everyone loved him. So again, he was really recruited to, quote, write that plan, what that syllabus, what is that going to look like? You are tasked to design the toughest physical training program on earth for Navy pilots. And again, that was the job that he was handed. He didn't really want to do it. He wanted to fight, of course. He was still a young man. But he took it in hand. He actually worked with his brother, Howard, and the two of them designed the program. About 3 months later, these Navy V5 aviation schools, the campuses, they slowly identified them in 5 different regions of the country. And then they opened them thanks to Hamilton and his brother and the work they did to design a syllabus where they rose basically at 5 a.m., trained all day and studied and just really got in the best shape of their lives using sport. And, of course, football, which was Tom Hamilton as a legacy. He's a member of I believe, the College Football Hall of Fame.
So let's get back to the Cloudbuster Nine. Can you talk about some of the individuals who played on that baseball squad. And then you kind of mentioned it, but who they played and why they were so famous.
Well, obviously, Ted Williams was really the most famous player, but there are others, Johnny Pesky from the Boston Red Sox, John Sain, Joe Coleman, Buddy Gremp. And then there were older players there on campus who were coaches like Harry Kraft. I've gotten to know his niece, Addie Beth Kraft Denson, who lives up in Dallas. And she, by the way, is writing a book about her Uncle Harry. Plug to her. But again, there were about 24 major league players in Chapel Hill during the service. And, again, John Sain was one of my favorites. I'll tell you about some of the players who were there. And in the very back of my book, I have their pictures with a very brief synopsis of their careers. There was Pete Appleton, who was a favorite player with the Cleveland Indians, the Cincinnati Reds, the Boston Red Sox, and the Yankees. Henry Victor, known as Vic Bradford, he played for the New York Giants. Joe Coleman, he came in from the Philadelphia Athletics with Ted in 1943. Dusty Cook, he was from North Carolina. He played for the New York Yankees, and he was a pharmacist mate in the service. So basically, from what I was told by one of the surviving players, is that when people got injured on the field, he took care of them. But he was also a coach. Harry Kraft from the Cincinnati Reds. Charlie Gehringer, famous Hall of Fame player from the Detroit Tigers, was one of the coaches at Navy Pre-Flight. Joe Gonzalez, who played for the Boston Red Sox. Charles Gelbert, who had played for the St. Louis Cardinals, the Reds, the Tigers, and the Senators, and the Boston Red Sox. And, of course, there was Buddy Gremp from the Boston Braves, who shipped in with Ted. Ed Moriarty, who had played with the Boston Braves, which was temporarily known as the Boston Bees. Al Neniak, he played for the Boston Red Sox and Philadelphia Athletics. And then Andy Pilney, who played for the Boston Bees. Alex Sabo with the Washington Senators. Johnny Sain played, obviously, for the Boston Braves, New York Yankees, Kansas City Athletics. Hal Shoemaker, who had played for the New York Giants. And then Ray Scarborough, one of my favorites. He was a North Carolina boy. He played for the Senators, the White Sox, the Boston Red Sox, the New York Yankees, and the Detroit Tigers. He was a pitcher from Mount Gilead, North Carolina. And he became known as the pickle peddler because during the off season, he worked for a pickle factory, Mount Olive Pickle in North Carolina. I mean, these were guys who painted houses in the off season. They sold cars. They sold insurance. You name it. It was a different time. But again, I think that's one of the reasons the money just wasn't there. Of course, they had the fame. It was just a different time, a different generation. But a few other players, Ray Stoviak, who played for Philadelphia, Robert H. Williams, who played for the Boston Braves, and, of course, the coach, Don Kepler. He was a minor league player. And then Glenn Killinger, he was one of the head football coaches. And then another one, Wes Shelmerick. He was another one of the pre-flight coaches who had made a major league debut with the Boston Braves in 1931. So again, a lot of coaches. There were a few major league coaches, but mainly, great college coaches and minor league coaches.
That is an amazing slate of individuals. How did the Cloudbusters do?
They won most of their games when the major league players came in. But from what I was told, they were not very good at all at the beginning of the season. Ivan, who was one of the first players to sign up, he said, I think there was a bulletin board, like maybe in the commissary or something, and it said anybody interested in playing on the Cloudbuster baseball team, sign up and come try out. And of course, Ivan was pretty good. He was a college baseball pitcher and, really talented. But what he told me, there were some guys who tried out who had literally never thrown a baseball. There were a lot of college players who were pretty good, but none of the major leaguers were there at the very beginning of that 1943 season. Now, everything changed around April and May when the timing was such that those major leaguers started to ship in pre-flight.
I can imagine when you'd play the Cloudbusters and they'd like, oh, we got an easy win, and then Ted Williams shows up.
Well, they were really protective of him. And you asked at the beginning of the interview why this story wasn't told. I mean, people like, Ben Bradley, they described his time at Chapel Hill at Carolina. There wasn't a lot written about it because they were so protective of Ted Williams, their players, because they needed to train. They didn't really, they let them off base a couple of times. There's some really famous pictures of Ted with Babe Ruth at that All-Star game up at Fenway Park in 1943. But they kept him on base because his life depended on it and the life of the other trainees that, were going to be fighting in the war. I mean, this was really serious. Of course, there was a little bit of backlash with the media, and they said, oh, here they come. They're riding on the bus into town. They're getting all this celebrity treatment, but where in fact they really weren't. They were working overtime. And there was a publicist by the name of Kid Brewer, a real colorful figure. He had played football at Duke. He just related to the athletes, and he was super, super protective of their privacy. Now, granted, he filled the mailbox up with press releases on all the famous people who came to Carolina. He was great at that. But when it came down to reporters wanting to come onto base just to probe, to spy, snoop, if you will, to look at the dorm rooms, they were like, no, I don't think so. I mean, unless they really trusted them. Guys like Grantland Rice, he trusted Grantland. He courted him to come onto base to actually try out some of the training himself. But again, they were super protective about the privacy of these players. Therefore, that's why there wasn't a whole lot written about it.
We actually start your book with this idea, or this the game between the Navy pilots and Babe's Yankee Lands.
Mm-hmm. Yanklands, yeah.
Could you talk about that? And then Babe Ruth's last at bat happens in that game.
At this point in the war, things were turning around, but people, they were down. They were scared. As you mentioned in the Green Light Letter, we really did need baseball to pull us through. And so the pre-flight school contrived a game, worked with the Yankees and Babe Ruth, kind of like a celebrity war bond game. And they had, of course, wanted to sell as many tickets as possible. And so Babe, but he also wanted to become a manager. So he said, look, I'll come in and manage this team, and I get to pick them, my lineup from the Yankees and the Indians. And we will face off against the Cloudbusters at the end of July in 1943. For a couple of weeks, they promoted it with the press. Now, one thing was really important. They said star players like Ted Williams wasn't going to get to go because at the time they were getting a little backlash about him being on the road. But again, they promoted it with some of the rest of the players. Again, it was Babe's chance to really prove himself as the manager. He was getting older. He had been ill. It was his personal dream, and he kept getting passed over. But again, they did play, and I don't want to tell you too much about what happened that day because it truly was amazing. Because I love people to actually read the book, especially kids who just love the story. But again, the pilots faced off against this special blended team against major leaguers. And they didn't really fill the ballpark up, but it was so full in spirit. And there was one reporter with the New York Times who wrote about that. And he said, this is just a time when the reporters bought tickets to the game, the managers bought tickets to the game, some of the major league players bought tickets to the game. And in the stands, they had kids and factory workers fresh off their shift. Lots of people from the military, but it was just one of these all-American moments where people were sacrificing for their country and they were coming together through baseball.
And I think that President Roosevelt realized that when you referenced the Green Light Letter, but Babe Ruth does as well. And he's a patriotic symbol at the time, and he's not able to serve, but he is able to raise money for the Red Cross,
right,
and war bonds and things like that.
Well, again, this is an example of, granted, he did want to prove himself as a manager, but if you look at Babe Ruth, such a big heart. And, when COVID broke out, I started looking at all the clips of Ruth with the polio victims, the kids, and he would do this on his own. Ted Williams did this to raise money for, kids with cancer through the Jimmy Fund. I mean, these players, they really wanted to help people. They had big hearts. And Babe Ruth, during the war, they said he was as American as the bald eagle. And sure enough, he volunteered his time just to reach out to people, reach out to kids, especially who he trusted and related to, those people in need.
Well, I want to bring it back around to your dad And could you explain what you uncovered about his baseball career that you may not have known when you were a little girl?
My father, he was a good guy, but he was troubled. I mean, he was frankly sad for much of his life. And he talked about baseball very much in the past of, well, when I struck out Mickey Mantle. I mean, what an experience. And I related to that, and I had a lot of sympathy for him. But what I learned about him was he truly was a star player. He went to Haverford Prep School outside of Philadelphia, was a star athlete there, played basketball and football as well. Was a star baseball pitcher at Carolina. Then he signed on with the Durham Bulls. I had heard these things, but I hadn't really seen them in print. And so when he passed away, I went down and I opened the scrapbooks, and then I pulled him up on the computer to look at his stats. So I see that, and then I saw some other clippings about, when he trained under Johnny Pesky, when he managed the Victoria Rosebuds, and how my dad was in the Texas League. And of course, when he was with the Detroit Tiger minor league system, and he had talked a lot about how desperately he wanted to make it into the major leagues, but he never really said what happened. And sure enough, I look in the scrapbook, and I can see him holding his arm. And I tracked down some players who played with him, and sure enough, like everybody else, he threw his arm out. I spoke to a man who became a good friend of mine, a psychologist in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I said to him, I'm like, what happens to a person like that when they become so close to making it to the major leagues and then they get hurt? So again, I discovered that he got hurt. And his whole identity was wrapped up in baseball. But when he was a young man, as a kid with the captain marvels of the game, and then he actually makes it into the minor leagues, and he's got a really good chance. And then he gets hurt, and then he wakes up and he's 50 years old. I'm 56 years old. And so here we are in mid to late life. And my friend, again, a brilliant man, he said he went through something called identity foreclosure. And it's just someone who they're just heartbroken about who they were, and they never quite come up with another identity. Like they'd rather be that person from the past, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and it teaches us about just the human condition, and it's just that other connection that baseball has in general with the human condition. Right.
We are fragile people. I mean, I've been very lucky with this book, and I think one of the reasons it's become, frankly, a top-selling baseball book is because of this World War II story and just the innocence of that era. But it was extremely painful for me to write, and I haven't really talked much about this, certainly publicly, but when I started writing the book, I was lucky enough to get an agent, Jim Hornfisher, and we sat down and he goes, Ann, you've got to tell your dad's personal story. I mean, anybody can write about the Cloudbusters, they can write about World War II, but please, you loved your dad, so you have good feelings about him, but please explain what happens to a little boy who's in the presence of just the gods of baseball, and then he grows up. What does that do? So I started working away on the book, and as I delved into the personal story about the tears that I saw on occasion, not very often, but he was very sad, about people maybe, he was a little misunderstood by maybe people that he worked with. He was a great salesman, but, a lot of people really admired him. A lot of people, they feel like, well, you didn't make it, you got to move on. But he was just, I think, he touched a star. He touched many stars as a child. It was like that child movie star experience, which you really just can't get over. It impacts you for the rest of your life because nothing else is as good enough. And so when I was writing the book and actually putting those memories that I remembered as a kid of him down in the basement, watching those 2 television sets, the box scores, chain smoking, and there was a little sadness there. When I finished the book and I gave my first book talk, my mother was with me, who's been very supportive, but my back kind of broke out in these what I thought were bites. I mean, I thought, well, I don't know where I sat in an anthill, but, I did it. And sure enough, I had broken out in shingles. And we all know what that is. I didn't know what it was, but it was somewhat painful, but it was the result of digging into his past and reliving a lot of his pain, because he was such a good guy. God knows. I talked to guys that he played with. In fact, after you write a book all kinds of people contact you. I was contacted by one of his teammates from Chapel Hill, and he said, "Oh, Ann, he was such a good guy. He was such a happy guy. I hated it when he didn't make it, but he said, let me tell you something about your daddy." He said he was in a fraternity, and this particular man who called me up is now a judge in North Carolina, but he said he didn't grow up with a whole lot of money, but they played baseball together, and he said that my father included him in everything. And so basically what he was saying is my dad was such a good guy. He was a generous guy. And I think when you unearth some of the good and the bad about a person's life, and we can all do that, we've all got those doors, it can be extremely painful. Now, God, I'm glad I did it. It has been so gratifying. And, when you get a phone call from somebody who just speaks the world of your father, it gives you encouragement. I have a daughter in high school, and I'm just like, do your best. Just things are not going to work out, but just keep reinventing yourself all along the way through life. And if you work hard, good things will come.
That's a great message about your book, and thank you for writing that aspect of the book as well. The last question I have is, through your research, what are some unexpected connections that you ran into and individuals that you unearthed in your research?
That's the thing, Rob, is there's so many unexpected things because this story wasn't fully told. And that's what I ran into like every day. I was like, oh my God, Eddie Rickenbacker was there. There's that story about fiction. The truth can be stranger than fiction, and that's what I experienced. But one thing that kind of blew my mind, there was every bay, if you will. This was like a cartoon comic book culture. Every bay had their own comic strip artists. They had their own designers. They had their own newspapers. They were heavy publicity just to boost recruiting, keep morale high. And in the Iowa station, there was a young man named Ted Drake. So he was probably in his early 20s, but he was a fabulous artist. And they had their own magazine. I think it was called the Spindrift. And, of course, that's where John Glenn was. Ted Drake, according to a gentleman who I interviewed named Jerry Holland, he's an admiral in the Navy now, was the kid mascot up at the Iowa station. And he said, yeah, I remember Ted Drake. He was the cartoon artist, and I used to go up and I would see him. And sure enough, and this was a crazy story, the culture inspired at these small pre-flight bases ended up being the inspiration for mascots. Ted Drake designed the mascot for the Fighting Irish with a little leprechaun, and he also designed the mascot for the Chicago Bulls. Now, he became a famous artist later in life, an illustrator, and he just passed away a few years ago, I believe, in his 90s. But he used to work for Wilson Sporting Goods. And so, again, he started in his early 20s as the comic book artist at the Iowa Pre-Flight Station and made a brilliant career as sports illustrator. I believe there's another painting that he did that might be up at Notre Dame at their Hall of Fame, or the Four Horsemen. So things like that, the mythology of the sport, these young men, comic book artists, they inspired that during World War II. And here we are today, still enjoying it. Never knew that this culture was inspired in these little offices at Navy Pre-Flight.
Is there anything that still hasn't been resolved?
Yeah, there's one mystery. Chapel Hill Pre-Flight had a young artist named Gene Imedo, and he was a cartoonist, but he also painted a portrait of the stereotypical Navy pre-flight cadet graduating, and he's flanked by young cadets wearing football uniforms, baseball uniforms, military tracks, carrying rifles. So in other words, the culture was all painted on one canvas, and this went all over the world, this portrait, and I've got many copies of it. You can pull it up online. But this painting mysteriously disappeared, and it was front and center at Navy Hall all through the war. And what I was told at the Navy ROTC offices, they thought that it was up in the attic. They never could find it. I've sent the archivist from the University of Chapel Hill Library, Wilson Library, to look for it because they have all types of artifacts. Didn't turn up there either. So very sadly, this particular artist, he left the station and died 3 months later in a training accident in Florida. So for all we know, the Navy may have shipped it to his poor grieving parents. But again, the whereabouts of the official Navy portrait of Navy pre-flight is unknown. So if anyone, you Google this, you see the colored oil painting, please let me know, because we would love to put that on exhibit. And I believe the University of North Carolina, after we're through with COVID, they're going to do a North Carolina baseball exhibit and feature pre-flight. And also the stadium, Boshamer Park at Chapel Hill, they're going to have some life-size portraits put up on the wall. And I think you're going to see some of the Navy pre-flight guys there just commemorating the history of North Carolina baseball and pre-flight during World War II.
Can you speak about the success of your book and where that's taken you?
It's been crazy, and it's just been so rewarding. I've given more than 60 talks. I've talked to the Baseball Hall of Fame. I spoke at the National Conference at Sabre, just did a talk with the Boston Red Sox historian, Gordon Eads, with the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I've done a lot of talks with Naval Academy chapters around the country, talks to Major League Baseball parks, but love my talks to independent bookstores. So if anybody wants me to come to a Zoom, I'd love to do that. But again, I've also done a documentary, did an interview with Fox Nation. They just did one that's now streaming on Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio when they went back to the White House in 1991 to get that award from their friend, President George H.W. Bush, commemorating, those magical seasons 50 years prior. I've done things with the World War II Museum, but again, the core message is really about service. And so, these talks have been wonderful because people have actually cried and they've come up to me. So there are a lot of men out there in particular, just like my dad, who got injured or they just, got married or they paused their baseball dreams. And that was just a huge experience for them. So they cry. I've even seen Marines cry just about the service and the sacrifice that these major leaguers made to their country. It's just astounding now today to think about it. So it's been a real honor and a privilege to give these talks and just to remind people we still got it in us. And again, one of the last things I'm doing is I'm interviewing the last surviving major league players who served in World War II. We're down to about 24 players. I've had the good fortune to interview guys like Tommy Lasorda, Dr. Brown, Eddie Robinson, he's going to turn 100 in December, by the way, and he's writing his second book. But, the messages are they're fearless. They are hugely, dedicated to service to country. They're generous people. And they believe in our country. And I think if anything, we live in difficult times. One message I want to leave to everyone, especially during COVID, is these guys, in their 90s, they listened to authority. When they told them to wear a mask, they wore masks. They didn't fight it. And they're just proud to support other people to help us get through hard times. And another thing, they don't seem to criticize each other. I mean, they want to support each other. They love their families. They have tremendous faith. And I had a great opportunity to talk to Vin Scully. And he's like, Ann, I've seen America down on its knees during World War II. And we fought and we rose like a tiger and we won the war. And, God knows we can certainly do this again. We've just got to have more faith and we've got to work together. So again, the book, it has become a best-selling baseball book. It's been in the top 10 on Amazon for a couple weeks. It's been in the number one slot for teens and young adult baseball readers. I'm just really grateful. The paperback just sold out. The hardback went through 3 printings. I was able to record the audio, but again, it's a evergreen story. And again, if people can just look at these guys and what they did for their country, and look at my dad's story, there was some pain there, but he was a good person who is inspiring people today from the beyond. So again, just have faith, and we shall overcome through these difficult times.
What a great message, Ann, and thank you for your story.
Of course. Well, thank you. I'm really honored. Love your part of the country, and I really want to come up and visit the museum someday.
I would like to thank my guest, Ann R. Keene. If you'd like to get her book, The Cloudbuster Nine, the untold story of Ted Williams and the baseball team that helped win World War II, just click on the link below. It is a great book. If you'd like to find out more information about Ann's work, all you have to do is go to www.annrkeene.com. That's www.ANNERKEENE.com. The featured brew was Tank 7 American Saison Ale from the Boulevard Brewing Company of Kansas City, Missouri. Remember, subscribing to the podcast will allow you to listen immediately when new episodes are released. If you would like information about guests and shows, just like our Facebook page, you can find a lot of information there. The music was provided by the band Bones 4, who are working on new music as we speak, and that's going to be released soon. There are many more episodes on the way featuring wild stories and interesting historical figures. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.